First of all, thank you to Anna and the organisers for inviting me to take part in this virtual meeting. I have a couple of preliminary comments before I get onto the paper. One is just a procedural warning. Sometimes my internet goes down, which is due to causes having to do with chaos. In fact, it went down a couple of days ago and didn't come back, but I have a procedure for getting around that, which is that I switched to using my mobile phone as a channel for data. So if I should suddenly disappear from your screens, don't panic. Leave the panicking to me, and I will go and route the session through my mobile phone. The third point is in comment on one of the remarks that Dariusz made at the beginning, which was about the widespread knowledge of Roman Ingarden. And I think that needs to be qualified. Roman Ingarden is relatively well known on the European continent, but is relatively unknown in the English-speaking world. In fact, probably the majority of people in the English-speaking world who know anything about Ingarden are here in this meeting. And Ingarden is even less well known in the part of the English-speaking world where I currently inhabit, which is Great Britain. I suspect that I'm probably the only person in the UK who knows much about Ingarden. Which is a shame. I mean, once Barry and Kevin had left, that was it. And at least at one point, there was no one because I wasn't in the UK either. So there is still a way to go. I think the English translations will help if people feel up to reading them. But I'm not terribly optimistic about how enthusiastically Ingarden will be received in the future in the English-speaking world, but maybe I'm just getting pessimistic in my old age. So what I have to say has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 parts, a short introduction, a section called The Spectrum of Theories About Fictions, a section called Ingarden's Moderate Realism, then a section called What is a Fiction? And finally, a section on classifying fictions. And I should say this is a much more tentative and probing or maybe questioning paper than Barry's, not because I think Ingarden is indeterminate, but because my own views are not very strongly formed in this area. So introduction, we're familiar with the distinction between real or actual objects, such as the Taj Mahal and John Lennon on the one hand, and fictional objects such as Minas Tirith and Frodo Baggins on the other. If you don't know Tolkien, bear with me, because most of my examples are from Tolkien, whom I read again during lockdown. Or as Rudolf Haller once called it, the distinction between facta and ficta. Now, what this distinction is taken to amount to varies widely according to philosophical view. And that's what I'm going to be talking about with special reference to Ingarden, although not exclusive reference to Ingarden. And as often I do when I'm talking about historical figures, I'm trying to combine saying something sensible about these historical figures with trying to learn something for myself about what they say, either by copying them or by criticizing them or trying to go further. And that applies in this case because I'm interested myself in fictions, partly because I have a rather slim ontology, and so a lot of things that other people think are facta, I think are ficta, so I need to get straight about what they are and how they work and how they relate to things that aren't ficta. So I must also say a word of thanks to the previous speaker, Barry, because as he indicated at the beginning of his talk, when he arrived in Manchester, he was bubbling with enthusiasm for Ingarden, somebody of whom I had at that stage never heard. And it was his enthusiasm and his advocacy of the need to read Ingarden and get one's head around what Ingarden said that led to me at least dabbling my toes in Ingarden scholarship. I could not regard myself as an Ingarden scholar, but I have written a few essays about him, and I go back to him from time to time. So thank you to Barry for introducing at least one Brit to Ingarden's work. Now, Ingarden's theory of fictional objects is principally in the literary work of art and in its sequel, The Cognition of the Literary Work of Art. But I shall be saying principally things about the theory and the literary work of art. And I'm not going to say anything either original or in great detail about this, because it's probably the best known part of Ingarden, certainly outside of Poland. So you can go and read lots and lots of essays about it. There are summaries in various places. There are encyclopedia articles and so on. So Ingarden's theory of fictional objects or of fictions fits into a spectrum of theories, quite a wide spectrum, ranging from what you might call extreme realism on the one hand about fictional objects to extreme anti-realism on the other. And at the moment, I'm just talking about fictional objects in the sense that Ingarden uses, namely the sort of things that novel writers and playwrights and maybe film script writers produce when they talk about fictional creatures or fictional characters of various kinds. So I'm using fiction at the moment in the relatively narrow sense that Ingarden talks about in literary work of art. They don't necessarily have to be literary fictions. We'll come on to different kinds in a minute. So amongst extreme realists, so what is a realist? Well, a realist is someone who believes that something exists and is independent in its existence and nature from us and our thoughts and our languages and our institutions. So an extreme realist would be someone who thinks that there are fictional objects in some sense or other. They are as they are independently of us, and their ontological status is as it is independently of us. And the most obvious extreme realist in this sense is Alexis Meinong. Meinong doesn't think that fictional objects exist because precisely he thinks they don't exist. They belong to that large group of objects which are non-existent objects for Meinong, but they are objects nevertheless. So it would be wrong to say, according to Meinong, that there are no such things as fictional objects. In fact, they are, if you like, among Meinong's paradigm examples of objects that don't exist. So you could take creatures out of any work of fiction, such as Hamlet from Shakespeare, or Frodo Baggins from Tolkien, or Sherlock Holmes from Conan Doyle, and so on. And Meinong would say that these are bona fide objects. They don't exist, but they do have properties, and by and large, the properties that are ascribed to them. That's Meinong's principle of the independence of so being from being. You can be of a certain kind or in a certain way without having to exist. And Meinong's view is that such fictional objects have a character that Ingarden also subscribes to and highlights, which is their incompleteness. That is, they are in various respects incomplete in the properties that they have. For example, Hamlet is, in the Shakespearean representation, neither left-handed nor right-handed, but we assume that he is in some way handed because he can manipulate a sword and kill Polonius. So Hamlet is handed, but he is neither left-handed nor right-handed, nor is he ambidextrous, Hamlet is indeterminate. We don't know how tall he is, whether he's blonde, brunette, red-haired or bald, and so on and so on. So there is a very small finite number of properties which are ascribed to Hamlet by Shakespeare, and these and
could you wait, because I think I've accidentally muted you. Could you unmute yourself? Because there's a person came on and I had to mute them, so I must have.
Myself as well?
Yes, yes.
Okay, you can hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so what did you last hear? Did I make lip movements that didn't have any noise?
Last 15 seconds.
The last 15 seconds. Okay, so for Meinong, as for Ingarden, fictional objects are non-existent, but they have certain characteristics or properties. And they can have these properties irrespective of the fact that they have no being whatsoever. They can even be inconsistent. And it's quite possible to have works of fiction that are inconsistent, or in some way incoherent or absurd, and that makes absolutely no difference to Meinong, because Meinong is infamously somebody who believes in inconsistent, or as he calls them, impossible objects, just as much as he believes in possible or consistent objects. So that is the most extreme kind of realism, or one of the most extreme kinds of realism. Now, there is another kind of extreme realism, which in many ways is even more unbelievable than that of Meinong, if that's possible, and I think it is possible, and that is what one might call concrete realism. The nearest to a view that one could imagine is the view of David Lewis in On the Plurality of Worlds. Lewis infamously and notoriously said that all possible worlds are equally real and just as real as ours, and that every possibility that there is realized in at least one possible world. So according to Lewis, there is at least one, I think probably infinitely many possible worlds in which there are concrete individuals having all the properties of Hamlet, and each one of them in his own particular world having large number, possibly infinitely many additional properties besides. So according to Lewis, there isn't one Hamlet, but there are many, almost certainly infinitely many Hamlets, so that Hamlet, the character, must be considered either as a plurality of individuals across possible worlds, or perhaps as a type which is realized in different possible worlds. Now, there is a particular problem, there are lots of problems with that, but there is a particular problem that Lewis has, which Meinong doesn't have, which is that the inconsistency of some fictional characters or fictional objects cannot be accounted for by Lewis, because each of Lewis's worlds is a possible world and therefore by definition consistent. So Lewis would have to find an epicycle to his theory in order to give an account of fictional objects which are inconsistent. As I say, I think incompleteness, although it's a little bit of a stretch for him, is something he can deal with without going outside his basic system, but I think inconsistency is a more difficult problem for him. There is another kind of relatively extreme realism. One could call it Mallian realism, after Ernst Mally, who was a student of Meinong's and indeed his successor at the University of Graz. Meinong didn't agree with, Mally didn't agree with Meinong's theory of non-existent objects. Mally put forward a view according to which what Meinong thought of as inconsistent objects or incomplete objects, the non-existent ones, were in fact objects which have two different modes of relation to properties. They can either instantiate or exemplify properties on the one hand, or they can embed properties on the other. And a contemporary philosopher who takes this line and in fact elaborates it in considerable detail as part of a much wider system is Ed Zalter in Stanford. So in his book Abstract Objects, Zalter takes Malley's core idea of an object with two different ways of instantiating or relating to properties and spins a whole theory out of it, which includes a theory of fictional objects. So a fictional object, according to Zalter, is an abstract object which has a number of properties it exemplifies, for example, that it is abstract, that it is fictional, that it is created by this or that author, but also has a suite of embedded properties, which are the ones that the author ascribes to the object. So, for example, take the fictional object Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes is a drug addict, he's a violinist, he is a misogynist, and he is also a brilliant detective. But none of these actually apply to anything in that area, because Sherlock Holmes is an abstract object, and no abstract object actually plays a violin. So there is another kind of realism which is somewhat different from all of these, but can, I think, still be called realism, which is type realism. According to this view, which is upheld by Nicholas Wolterstorff and Greg Curry, and possibly some others, fictional objects are not individuals, they are types or universals. So Hamlet is a type, he's a universal, perhaps a complex universal. He's human, he's indecisive, he is easy to anger, and so on and so on. But he's not a concrete object, so it's no use looking for him in any particular part of the world, such as Denmark. Now, I don't know an awful lot about type realism. It strikes me as a bit of a cop-out, but I better not say anything more about it. The only thing that slightly worries me about it is that some fictional characters, some fictional authors seem to create new types, not just new individuals in their fictions. So in The Lord of the Rings and in The Hobbit, Tolkien creates hobbits, which are a type which are not exemplified in the real world. And in the Star Trek movies, the writers create Klingons, which are not exemplified in the real world. So it looks as though not all types which occur in fiction are ones which find instantiation in individuals in our world. There are uninstantiated and perhaps completely made up types. Whether that's a problem for them or not, I think it probably isn't. I think they would simply say, well, there are uninstantiated types as well as instantiated ones. In other words, they'd just be Platonist about those types. Now, for all of these extreme realists, there is a single problem. It certainly applies to the first three kinds I mentioned, which is the problem of creativity or creation. We standardly think that authors like Tolkien or Shakespeare or Conan Doyle create their fictional characters, that they bring them into being in some way or other. And this is a view that Meinong holds very tenacious, sorry, not Meinong, Ingarden holds very tenaciously. But according to Platonists or Meinongians or concrete realists, or Malians, what an author or creator does when producing a work of art or a work of fiction in which there are fictional objects is simply to select or pick out an entity which exists already in its own right, in some mode or other, or in the case of Meinong, doesn't exist but is something in its own right. So I mean, this may be an aesthetic criticism. I personally think it's an ontological criticism. I think authors create things, at least if you're going to be at all realist about the way in which you discuss fictional objects. They certainly create texts or scripts or films or something like that in which fictional objects are depicted, but the natural inclination is to say not just that they create these media which represent fictional objects, but that they create the fictional objects themselves. And that is, I think that's a fairly telling criticism of any extreme realist theory like that of those that I've mentioned so far. Now, I'm going to skip over the moderate position for the moment, which is Ingarden's position. I'm going to go to the opposite position. The opposite position is one or another form of anti-realism. Anti-realism would say there are no fictional objects. This is strong anti-realism. It's not just that there are fictional objects, but they depend in some way on us, which you might call weak anti-realism or weak realism, depending on whether your ontological glass is half full or half empty. But an anti-realist is someone who says, well, when the philosophical chips are down and we're sitting in the philosophy room and not talking to our mates in the pub, then you have to say there are no fictional objects. Now, what if an anti-realist, and there are several kinds of anti-realists, and I actually find all of their theories implausible, but that's another story, and I'm not going to discuss them in detail. What any anti-realist has to do, because they are in many respects sitting on the shorter end of the lever over against the realist, because a lot of people, perhaps a majority, are prepared to say that in some sense or other there are fictional objects. The anti-realist has the struggle to convince people how it is that we can tell stories about things which don't exist in such a way as to account for a series of apparently true kinds of propositions about fictional objects. And I've taken the list of kinds of proposition that are made. I've not made this up. I've taken it from an article on fictional objects from this book, which is the Routledge Companion to Metaphysics. It's an article by a man called Richard Hanley, and it's just simply called Fictional Objects. And what Hanley says is that there are a number of data that theorists of fictional objects have to account for or explain, whether they're realists or anti-realists. And the data in this case, in his case, consists of a list of kinds of statement that can be made about, or apparently about, fictional objects. And he divides them into kinds, and I'm going to run through these kinds because I think it's a useful classification. Firstly, there are critical statements, which are meta statements about fictional objects. For instance, Sherlock Holmes first appeared in publication in 1887, or Sherlock Holmes has influenced many successive writers in subcultures of fiction. Then there are fictional statements, which are statements about what goes on in the fiction. For instance, Holmes can often be quite dispassionate and cold. However, when hot on the trail of a mystery, he can display a remarkable passion despite his usual languor. And Holmes is proud of being British. Then there are what he calls the third class are conative attitude statements like, I admire Holmes because he makes such amazing leaps of imagination. I could personally ever aspire to be Watson, who plods along limply behind. Then there are what he calls carryover statements, which are statements about the effects of the fictional character or object on other writers or artists. For instance, that Sherlock Holmes and his characteristics have had a considerable influence on subsequent writers of crime fiction. Then there are mixed statements. One is that in 2002, Holmes was inducted as an honorary fellow of the Royal Society of Chemistry. If that's true, I think it's very funny. A mixed statement, another one which I knew about, is that Holmes lived at 221B Baker Street. Now, 221B Baker Street is not a real address in London, but actually now there is a Sherlock Holmes museum opposite a place in Baker Street which labels itself 221B and is photographed in large numbers by Japanese tourists, or at least it was until this year. So that's a mixed statement, because it's partly a statement about Holmes and partly a statement about the real world. He also says there are creativity statements, such as that Holmes is the creation of Scottish author and physician Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who incidentally believed in paranormal phenomena and was very unlike his creation Holmes. And then there's the last one, which he doesn't list separately, but which I think are quite interesting, which are counterfictional statements. We're familiar with counterfactual statements, for instance, that I don't know, had Truman not authorized the dropping of the atom bomb on Japan, there would have been another 500,000 casualties in the war. That would be a counterfactual statement. But a counterfictional statement imagines what things would have been like in the fiction had the fiction not turned out the way it did. For instance, had Portia not described Shylock's request to take a pound of Antonio's flesh in such a precise and indeed finicky way, then maybe Shylock would have been able to extract his pound of flesh. Or had Sherlock Holmes decided after all to get married, would it have ruined his career as a detective? So counterfictional statements like that, they also seem, I mean, counterfactual statements have problematic truth conditions, counterfictional ones even more problematic. But very often when looking critically at works of art, one thinks of things like, well, if only Tamino hadn't been such a wimp, then the fight against the Queen of the Night wouldn't have had to have been led by Papageno and Pamina. So things like that. If Tamino had been less of a wimp, he might have actually done, a lot of the work. Okay, things like that. So that's fun. Okay, so now we come to where the truth possibly lies, which is what you might call moderate realism or moderate anti-realism, depending on your point of view. And this is where we find Ingarden. Ingarden is not the only moderate realist in this respect. I'm going to call him a moderate realist because he thinks, modulo what Ed said earlier about purely intentional objects not existing, that was news to me too. He believes that there are purely intentional objects which are created or brought into being by authors, so they're derived in the sense of der Streit, they're not originary, and they are sustained in being, they are dependent in some way or other on readers, texts, and other objects which anchor them in physical reality. So I personally think it's the notion of anchoring a purely intentional object in physical reality so that the creations of an author may be made intersubjectively accessible, which is probably the most interesting feature of Ingarden's view itself. So now a little bit about Ingarden itself, and I'm going to be very brief on this because, first of all, I'm sure most of you know it very, very intimately. And secondly, I'm really only going to focus on one or two aspects of Ingarden's view, some of which I think is extremely plausible and some of which I'm not so happy about. So as well known, Ingarden regards the literary work of art as a stratified item, a stratified entity. It's a production by an author, but it's not a simple production. It's not like just a noise or writing a single word down using graphite on a piece of paper as people used to do in the old days. Sorry, that's my cat. Ingarden thinks that the literary work of art is a stratified phenomena with 4 strata. The lowest stratum is the stratum of phonetic or verbal sounds and phonetic complexes of higher order. So these are basically noise of word types and word complex types. I think you'll have to treat them as types rather than tokens because of the repeatability of tokens. So it doesn't make any difference to a work of literature, for example, whether it is present in 1 copy or in 1 million copies. It may make a difference to J.K. Rowling's bank account, but it makes no difference to the existence or non-existence of the entities therein depicted. So I think we have to talk about verbal sound types or phonetic complex types of words and of complexes of higher order, so of phrases, sentences, sentence groups, paragraphs, chapters, and so on, right up to and including the whole work itself as a complex type. Now, I used to be rather skeptical about this for one reason, which is that most of the literary works of art that we are familiar with are not phonetic complexes, they are graphemic complexes. They are written texts. We're not talking about other kinds of works of art at the moment. And written texts are definitely not phonetic, they are graphemic. Now, there are obviously connections, which we know all about, between phonetic and graphemic complexes, which are given by the usual orthographic pronunciation rules of the language in question. There's an interesting question, by the way, as to whether a work of art in one language, which is translated into another language, is the same work of art or not. We tend to think it is, although we are also more or less critical of the veracity or appropriateness of the translation in various cases. But provided not too much is, if you like, poetic or phonetically significant about the work of art, then I think one might well take, for instance, a translation of Shakespeare's Hamlet into German or Russian as a representation of the same characters and the same situations as the late Middle English, early modern English original by Shakespeare, in which case the work of art isn't one complex of, the bottom stratum, sorry, is not one complex of phonetic items, but something like an equivalence class of such complexes under a relation of good translation, whatever that is. Now, as I say, I used to be very skeptical about the idea of there being a phonetic basis. To some extent, that has to be qualified, especially nowadays, because of the prevalence of something called audiobooks. Audiobooks are what you get when a reader, typically one reader, but it doesn't have to be a one reader, reads out from a literary text or some other text and creates a recording of it, which can be listened to over and over again. Now, audiobooks are produced for various purposes. One is to enable people with visual impairment to listen to stories which they would otherwise miss. Another is to while away long transcontinental journeys on American interstate highways. But the existence of audiobooks is definitely adds another element to what goes on at the basis. So the bottom level turns out to be more complex in at least two dimensions than Ingarden gave it credit for. I remember, just as a matter of personal history, that there were some very, very good audiobook recordings of children's books involving a fictional character called Winnie the Pooh, who was a bear, a toy bear, written originally by an English author called A.A. Milne, and beloved of English parents ever since. And my children enjoyed Winnie the Pooh, not so much when I read it, but when it was read to them on audiobook by Alan Bennett, who is himself a considerable writer. Now, the next level up, the second stratum, is semantic units, which are meanings of sentences and complexes of sentences. Again, I'm sure these should be understood as a stratum of abstract and repeatable entities, because meanings in general are abstract, although they may be instantiated or realized in particular utterances and in particular graphological complexes. The fact that there is a phonemic and a semantic level in Ingarden, I think, is a good reflection of his understanding of the interesting complexities of language. I personally don't think it goes far enough. I think there needs to be an intermediate morphemic level so that there are at least three strata. There is the phonetic or graphemic strata, which can be treated as, in some sense, equivalents. There is a morphemic one, which combines phonemes into words, and indeed into morphemes. And then there is the semantic one, which takes these morphemes, including words, and sprays meaning on them so that the whole thing becomes meaningful. And there may be further levels as well. In one of the theories of what was called stratificational grammar by a man called Stanley Lamb, I think was his name, there were 6 different strata or languages, but various people have thought that there are at least 3 or 4. So I think Ingarden was going along the right lines there, but he might have been not as up to date in his linguistics back in the 1920s as we would say now. Those are the bottom 2 levels. Now, in many ways, for the question of what fictions are, they're the basis, but they're not what's really interests us. The third level or stratum is what Ingarden calls the stratum of schematized aspects of objects, which are, if you like, how the objects themselves are presented through the text or through the representation to the reader or recipient. Firstly, they strongly resemble.
So we had some cutoff. If you could repeat the last 10 seconds again, because.
Okay, so schematized aspects strongly resemble Husserl's theory of noemata, and I think that's about all I want to say, actually. I don't think I have a lot more to say about this. The really interesting level is the 4th level, which is the objects projected by the text or by the representational medium in the circumstances in which they are portrayed. And these are the fictional objects that we need to be interested in. And they are the things that tend to interest not only readers and other recipients, but they are the things which are most often talked about in connection with fictional objects. So they are things like characters, situations, places, and to a certain extent, moods and various other things. And there is a whole other dimension to works of art which Ingarden talks about, which is what he calls the metaphysical qualities. Those are things like dread and optimism, and the sort of area where values and the way things affect us come out of literary and other works of art. And I'm not going to talk about those at all because they're orthogonal to what I am interested in. So Ingarden's view then is that fictions, that is the objects portrayed, are brought into being, are created by the author, but they do not exist autonomously, they don't pre-exist. They obtain or get their characters by virtue of the artistic or other decisions of the author. Sometimes the author is not wholly in charge. There are interesting cases I could talk about. And they are those things which most interest the potential reader or recipient. And they're the things that philosophers of fiction most often talk about. There are other things they could talk about, but those are the things they most often talk about. And what Ingarden says is the reason why these things can be intersubjectively accessed and discussed reasonably, rationally, pre-Derrida anyway, and disagreed about, possibly truly, possibly falsely, possibly non-cognitively, is that they are anchored in texts, and that these texts have copies which are accessible physically to readers, or there are copies of other sorts and other kinds. So that's, I think, the thing that's really innovative. It's not, I mean, something you wouldn't think of yourself, but Ingarden makes it characteristic of these dependent objects, these fictional objects, that they depend in one way on their creator, but the creator can die and the objects don't die with him or her. So they continue to exist for as long as there are texts which anchor them in reality and recipients. So if all the human beings die out because of coronavirus, then all the fictional objects will die out with them, even if the texts sit there not being interpreted. They might come back to life if a future alien civilization learns to understand what the texts say, but if all the texts go, then all we have left is memory. And in fact, that was all that there was before texts existed. During the period of oral transmission, the anchorage was in the minds of storytellers and in the memories of people who listened to their stories. And that was much more unstable than texts. So it gave rise to much more variability. You only have to read about the old sagas and the old myths to see that. Okay, so now why should somebody who's not necessarily an Ingarden scholar be interested in that? Well, one reason is because one might be interested in giving an anti-realist account of things which aren't fictional characters, or maybe which are fictional characters. But then we might want to broaden the notion of a fiction. And in fact, I do want to broaden the notion of a fiction. But it's not easy to say what a fiction is. Every time I've tried to say what a fiction is, I come back to that paradigm case of creatures of fiction, that in the narrow sense, but there are lots of other cases. There are those who are portrayed in films, in plays, in these days computer games, which have their own characters, and indeed in many other ways. So I'm going to essay a very tentative definition of what it is to be a fiction, and I expect you to drive a coach and horses through it in discussion, which will be fine. Now, there is, as far as I can see, no such thing as a fiction in and for itself. So I'm going to relativize the notion of fiction to two groups of subjects, two groups of possible recipients or participants in interaction. I will say something is a fiction for a subject or subjects A with respect to a subject or subjects R. So A stands for anti-realists and R stands for realists. So there's a group of anti-realists and a group of realists. There has to be at least one of each group for this definition to work. If everyone's on one side, it doesn't work. Fortunately, people are so varied and in some cases so there are realists and anti-realists on the side of most disputes of this kind. So a fiction is something is a fiction for subjects A with respect to subjects R if it is a putative object or object type which the realists R treat as existent or as a genuine object or type of object, but which the anti-realists judge and treat as non-existent. So basically, it's an object for which there are two groups of people, some who think it exists and others think it doesn't exist. And it's a very, very vague definition, but I think that suits the subject matter, because I think the notion of fiction is astonishingly vague. And what's surprising is, if you look in the philosophical literature, as far as I have been able to discern, there is no attempt to define it. So maybe this is a good place to start. Now, it's obvious for two reasons. Firstly, there are two comments on this. Firstly, one person's fiction may be another person's non-fiction. So one person's fictum is another person's factum. So if I'm an atheist, for instance, God is a fictum for me, but for a theist, God is a factum. So we disagree about whether God exists. That's straightforward. If one is a Platonist, then abstract objects are genuine existing objects. They may be different from us, but they are genuine objects. But for a nominalist, they are fictions. They are things which Platonists treat as in some way real or genuine, but nominalists say they are wrong to do so. There are no such things. And you could just simply take any metaphysical dispute or indeed any existential dispute and look at the two sides. And for one side, the realist side, certain kinds of objects or certain objects do exist, and for the other side, they don't exist. Now, since Ingarden takes it to be the case that fictional creatures, like characters in literary works of art, do exist, and I'm hanging on to that old, I thought, orthodox view, then Ingarden is a realist, albeit he's a weak realist or moderate realist, and others such as myself are anti-realist. So they are fictions for me, but not really for Ingarden. And we can tell stories about lots of other things about which there have been disputes: ghosts, time travel, astrology, phlogiston, the Jewish world domination plan, the conspiracy to kill John F. Kennedy, and so on. That's the first point. So one person's fiction is another person's non-fiction. And secondly, for any case, or more or less any case, one side may be right and the other side may be wrong, and we may or may not know that. So in the case of metaphysical disputes, there is often, we're often in a state of uncertainty as to whether the realist or the anti-realist is correct, and that goes for lots of others. Now, I've talked about fiction in this very broad sense, and I'm going to talk for another 5 minutes, and then that will give us time for a bit of discussion. I always overrun. Fictions, in the sense that Ingarden discusses in the literary work, are only one kind, according to that much broader definition that I've given. Ingarden has a very rich ontology, so he believes in God, he believes in states of affairs, he believes in ideal objects, he believes in events and processes, he believes in substances, he believes in purely intentional objects, empirical possibilities, and past situations, all sorts of things. He has a nice rich ontology with 15 basic classes, or possibly 14 that are exemplified. But somebody who doesn't agree with Ingarden's ontology will say, well, some of those are actually fictitious. They will say, in Ingardenian terms, well, that's all right for the ontology, but that doesn't work for the metaphysics. That particular ontological category that you, Professor Ingarden, have said is one we should consider, for instance, God or ideal objects. That's not actually exemplified. If you're an atheist and a nominalist, you would say that. But there are different kinds of fiction in there, and I think we need something like a taxonomy. Maybe we could use Barry's basic formal ontology to help us out on this. I hope so. We need something like a taxonomy of candidate fictions, and I've got a few suggestions, but they are extremely unsystematic. Firstly, we must distinguish between things which are just made up and things which have some kind of basis in reality. An example of something that's just made up is the hobbits in Tolkien's fantasy about Middle-earth. Middle-earth, the hobbits, Sauron, orcs, and all that good stuff. They're all things that were the product of the imagination of John Tolkien. They're a wonderful, very rich, very full set of creations, and they interact beautifully. They form some kind of fictional system, perhaps in Barry's sense, but they are just made up. If Tolkien had decided, for instance, that Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin were not actually 4 hobbits, but only 3, because Sam was in fact Frodo sent back from the future in an elven time machine to assist current Frodo, then there would have been 3 hobbits in the search for the ring and not 4. So, and if Tolkien had decided that, the only thing that would have suffered from it, apart from the fact that he would have written a different work, is that he would have written a far more silly work than the one he in fact wrote. So our aesthetic judgment would have changed. But there are other fictions which are widely accepted as fictions which do have a basis in reality. And I'm going to give you an example from population statistics. It's called total fertility rate. You can look it up on Wikipedia, which is where I looked it up and found out all about it. Total fertility rate is a rather sophisticated statistical measure of the rate at which women in a certain part of the world over a certain period are producing children. It's more complex and more sophisticated than simple birth rate. Now, I don't care how you define it, but the point is, just as a matter of fact, the highest total fertility rate in the world in 2019 was in Niger, where it was, I think, 7.02. So that was the average, roughly speaking, the average number of children that women in Niger were having in 2009. And its lowest is in South Korea, where it's 0.92. So averagely, women in South Korea were having fewer than one child. Now, as we know from averages in general, averages are not real things. For instance, the average throw on a fair die is not one of the sides you can throw. It's 3.5. Nobody ever throws the 3.5, but nevertheless, the average throw is 3.5. And total fertility rate is one of those statistical fictions which are there to help us make sense of, for instance, why the population of Niger is growing and that of South Korea is shrinking. But those are widely accepted as fictitious. The statisticians say that this is the number of children an imaginary woman has in that particular polity. And a woman can't have 7.02 or 0.92 children, so it's not a real woman. But it has a basis in fact. In fact, it has a basis in thousands or millions of facts about women in a certain part of the world having a child at a certain age during their childbearing years in a certain part over a certain period. So it is what I call a founded fiction. It's not just something that somebody made up. It has its basis in fact. Now, there are lots and lots of founded fictions, and some of them may fall into the category that Barry was talking about. For instance, exchange rates between currencies are in a certain sense founded fictions, but boy, do they matter. So that's another one. Some fictions may be founded not on contingent facts like how many children women are having, but on necessary facts, or at least on things that apply of necessity. For example, if you believe that the natural numbers are fictions, they may nevertheless be founded on actual facts which exist of necessity, namely that certain collections of objects have certain cardinalities or numbers of members. I personally don't believe that, but that's one way in which you could do that. And if you believe, for instance, that lots and lots of objects exist necessarily, then there would be founded fictions whose basis is in necessary truths rather than in just contingent truths. Then there are various kinds of theoretical fictions. So one kind of theoretical fictions are idealizations. For instance, in Newtonian mechanics, you have point masses. There are no point masses because they'd have to have infinite density. Or you have frictionless planes, or you have perfectly elastic bodies which bounce off each other with coefficient of restitution 1. Those don't exist in reality, but they are useful diversions from reality which enable us to get a handle on real phenomena. But everyone knows that there are in reality no point masses. Statistical fictions are ones that I've mentioned. Then there are what you might call evanescent fictions. These are things like what you dreamt about last night. I dreamt about a particularly obnoxious Austrian customs officer who wanted me to fill in a form U64 before he would let me enter the country. Bizarrely, the conversation was in German, so I do sometimes dream in German. And he wouldn't give way, and I tried to argue with him, and the bastard wouldn't let me get away with it. So that was, and until I told you about it, nobody knew about this. That's a fiction which lasted for a few seconds and which has almost no significance whatsoever, and very little apart from the fact that when I woke up, I was rather annoyed. Then there are perceptual fictions like hallucinations and chimera and things like that. There are probably what you might call fictions of outdated or superseded science, like the planet Vulcan or the substance phlogiston or the choleric temperament or astrological influences. And then there are not last but not least, there are fictions of radically misguided or crazy views like flat earthers and moon landing fake conspiracy theorists. And then finally, there are the ones that philosophers spend most of their time arguing about, controversial cases like universals, souls, mathematical objects, and indeed fictional objects in Ingarden's sense. So I think those are a number of characters that you could use to start constructing something like a taxonomy of fictions. And I think on that basis, you might want to deal with different kinds of fictions in different kinds of ways. And you might be realists about some, but not about others. So I think I should better end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now we have an occasion to react. And I'm sure that our reactions are not fictional, at least our feelings are something real. I don't know about the status of these icons on our screens, but for sure our emotions and reactions are something real. Okay, and now let me open the discussion. I see that Barry Smith wanted to begin. Yes, and then Professor Świderski and Professor Woleński. Okay.
You are already unmuted, so.
Barry, you have to unmute yourself.
No, you're already unmuted, so you should be able to talk.
Maybe he's not there.
Oh, so
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear great. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
So there was one point where I think you missed something. You were talking about a novel could exist in millions of copies, and you inferred from this that a novel is a type.
Yeah.
Now, I don't believe that. My view of types is that they are universals in an old-fashioned Aristotelian sense, and I don't believe that you can invent or create types. So I make an exception for manufactured objects like cars. I think maybe there are types of cars, but that's some relatively unimportant sense in which the term type can be extended. I don't think it can be extended to make Beethoven's Ninth Symphony a type, or War and Peace a type, or Moby Dick a type. What I want to say, and this is actually based on your own ideas about generically dependent continuance, is that there are two kinds of dependence. There is specific dependence, where A depends specifically on B, means if the instance A exists, then the instance B exists. So my headache is specifically dependent upon me, because you can't have my headache. Headaches can't migrate. And then generically dependence, where A is generically dependent on B, means that A can't exist unless B exists, or something very similar to B exists. Now, what this means is that in regard to novels, there are two types, or two universals. There's the universal novel, and Moby Dick is an instance of that type. Yeah. And then there is the universal copy, and your copy of Moby Dick is an instance of that type. Your copy of Moby Dick is a physical object. It has a mass. You can burn it. Moby Dick itself is not a physical object. It's a generically dependent continuant.
Okay, yeah, I'll probably buy that. It is certainly, I'm sure you're right that it needs more elaboration. I think it's interesting to talk about different ways in which things like types may or may not depend on other things, whether they are their instances or on other things. So the type Moby Dick depends complexly not only on texts, but on readers, and in a different way, of course, on the author. So again, if I said if all human beings die out, then it doesn't matter how many copies of the text you have, the novel Moby Dick has ceased to exist. On the other hand, if all the texts disappear, then no matter how many people you have, then in another sense, the novel has disappeared too. But yeah, you're right, it needs a bit more work. Thank you.
Okay, Professor Świderski was the second one to ask.
Yeah, picking up on the same point that Barry raised, this is a bit of a pedantic point. In fact, there is in musical ontology a hell of a discussion that's been going on for 30, 40 years now as to the status of the musical work. And as you probably know, there are many people who think that musical works are types. And that raises the problem, how can we reconcile our belief and our hope that musical works are created with the idea that they might be universals, given that the one work can be performed many, many times in different places and so on without losing its identity, apparently.
Yeah.
So the pedantry here is simply, I refer you to Gerald Levinson,
Yeah.
who he tried to come up with a concept which is debated still to this day of so-called indicated types.
Yeah.
The musical work consists of two parts. It is an abstract sonic structure tethered to performance means, which are types in themselves, but they belong to tradition. Hence, they have their grounding in the human world.
Yeah.
So that is, so to speak, his attempt to say that indeed we can create types.
Yeah.
And once created, we function in the way that people usually say that the same thing can be played over and over and over again, although it has a historical origin.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for reminding me about Jerry Levinson. I read it a long time ago. I thought it was a good paper at the time. I can't remember whether I still think it's a good paper, so let's leave that out. I'd have to go back and revisit it. I think probably I'd be more critical now than I was then. One of the most recent arch Platonists is Julian Dodd, now formerly of Manchester, now in Leeds. Yeah. And I've exchanged banter with Julian about this, but I think it's just crazy to think that Beethoven's ninth abstract entity was there all along. But I haven't done the work, so I can't really.
Kiwi says the same thing. So
indicate. Yeah, I mean the indicated types are, but again, I think it takes away something from the creativity of the author or initiator to say, well, what they've done is they've done stuff such that they've ended up instantiating or pointing to either a single universal type or a family of closely associated ones. So, I still think there are problems for it.
There was a bit of, Madam Moderator, Professor Brozik, may I make one more comment?
Only short one, because
yes,
we are already delayed. Okay. No,
yes, so. Okay. Peter, you said that Ingarden's whole conception is finally somehow anchored in texts. I'd like to point out that there may be a bit of an ambiguity here, because there are people who use the word text in a semantic sense, whereas what you're referring to probably is book, a physical object of some kind.
Yes, that's right.
I have a title here right in front of me, Peter Lamarck's book, Work and Object.
Yeah.
Where in fact he wants to say that the work is precisely this Ingardenian thing, if you will, whereas the object is the book eventually, which bears it. And last point in this case, you said it's anchored in text. In fact, if you know the literary work of art, he ends the book by saying that the basis of the literary works of art identity, allowing for communication about it, is in effect ideal concepts.
Yes, I know he does, but I don't believe that. Anyway, I think there is a much more mundane explanation of how we all understand that without having to resort to Platonic ideal concepts. But that's a long, long story. Okay.
He gave that up after a while, though. That was in.
Okay, well, good for him. The difference between texts and works, absolutely agree with that. I was using texts to mean books and the writing.
I took that.
There is a more technical sense of text used in what's sometimes called, oh God, what was it called? I've forgotten it. The grammar of cohesion. Halliday wrote about this in the 80s, I think, where he analysed the ways in which different sentences can go together to give you semantic complexes of higher order using things like anaphora and pronominal cross-reference and so on. Yes. And Halliday and Hassan cohesion, and that text in that sense can be treated as semantic units which are greater than or more complex than single sentences, but which nevertheless in some sense form a whole or a system or something like that.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you. And the last question, this discussion, Professor Woleński.
No, thank you, because flow of time is not a fiction, so I resign.
Send me an email, Jan.
Sorry?
Send me an email if it's really good.
No, okay, so because I would like to return to Ingarden, there is, I remember his motivation for this idea of fiction. He was interested only in literary fiction,
Yes.
nothing more. And he wanted to have a metaphysical uniformity, namely fictional characters couldn't act together with real characters. So this was a reason that this idea of intentional reality was uniform.
Yeah.
So I remember from many seminars and his talks at meetings of Polish Philosophical Society. So he was not interested in other fictions completely.
Okay.
It was a very, very important reason, to avoid that the fictional character merit real character.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, there's just one comment. One of the interesting things that philosophers of fiction need to take account of is the way in which fictional characters, in some sense or other, I'm being very loose about this, affect real individuals. For instance, you worry about the fate of some hero or heroine. You are upset about what happens in a particular story. You treat something or some event as something to emulate or to avoid in your own life. So obviously there is a causal story to be told in terms of what's going on in your neuronal stuff. But some people talk about this in ways in which suggests that fictional characters can at least indirectly have causal powers. Personally, I think they don't, but one needs to say what's going on in that case. I better stop, Anna, because we've overrun. Thank you.
Okay, thank